"And you're not the woman they say you are," he replied. The tension snapped, not in violence, but in a rush of feeling. Her lips met his, a slow, uncertain touch that carried every unsaid word. His hands, rough from years of cuffs and battles, found the curve of her back, while hers traced the scars life had carved into him. The storm outside raged, but here, inside, they found a different kind of storm. One of longing, of pain, of two souls who had only known battles but had now found a moment of surrender. It wasn't wild or rushed. It was something rare, a collision of wounds and warmth. Pastor David once stood tall as a man of God and a man of honor. He had left his life as a detective behind to lead his church, and his ministry was growing. People respected him, they trusted him, but everything changed the night he was framed. It started at Westbrook Academy, an elite school where David served as chairperson of the school development committee. During his time there, he found something shocking. Powerful men were stealing school funds. They offered him money to keep quiet. He refused. When threats didn't work, they decided to destroy him. The trap was set during a school fundraiser. It was supposed to be a night of joy, music, laughter, and giving. But suddenly masked men burst in with guns. They stole the fundraiser money and vanished into the night. Moments later, the police searched David's car and found some of the stolen money hidden under his seat. David tried to explain, but his body felt weak. His tea that night had been drugged. His head spun, his voice slurred. The next thing he knew, cold handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The news called him the Holy Robber. Behind this plan was Superintendent Titus, a man David once knew from his days as a cop. But David didn't know the whole truth. He didn't know who had planted the money in his car, or why someone close to him had betrayed him. Thrown into prison, David felt his world fall apart. His name was ruined. His church turned its back on him. But as he sat alone in that cold cell, one thing kept his heart beating. "I will clear my name. I will find the truth." The clatter of boots echoed in the halls. In the middle of it all, Pastor David ran. His body was weak from prison fights, diet, and general life in the cage. His ribs showed through his torn shirt, and every step burned his legs. But his mind was sharp. Years as a detective taught him how to move in the shadows. And tonight, the darkness was his ally. He slipped through a broken maintenance door, his heart pounding like a hammer. Pipes dripped above him as he crawled through a narrow tunnel. The air smelled of rust and sewage, but he kept going. His hands bled from scraping against rough walls. But he didn't stop. Suddenly he heard voices, guards checking the tunnel. David pressed his body against the cold metal, his breath slow and shallow. The beam of a flashlight passed inches above his face. "Clear," a guard shouted. David waited until their footsteps faded, then pushed forward. Moments later, he found a rusted grate. With the last of his strength, he forced it open and climbed out. Outside, rain poured from the sky. It soaked his body, but he didn't care. He was free, but freedom meant nothing if he couldn't clear his name. He needed help. He needed someone who understood the underworld. Pastor David walked throughout the night using ways and allies he knew authorities wouldn't think of finding him there. He needed a place where the police wouldn't least suspect. Hours later, he reached her mansion in Newlands. Cameras watched him as he stumbled up the driveway. The doors opened and there she stood, Dorothy aka Lady D, dressed in short blue dress, her eyes sharp and dangerous. She frowned. "David!" His body gave up and he collapsed on her doorstep. Moments later, David sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a warm towel. His skin was bruised, his face hollow from suffering. But his voice was steady as he told her everything. The fundraiser, the frame-up, the betrayal. When he finished, Lady D's face was hard. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "You're a wanted man. Helping you could destroy everything I've built." "I had no choice," David replied, his voice low. "If I did, I wouldn't be here. You are my only hope." Lady D stared at the fire, her jaw tight. "You don't know the underworld like I do. It's ruthless. If we step into it, there's no turning back." David's eyes met hers. "Then let's not turn back. Someone destroyed my life. Help me find out who." For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, Lady D's lips curved into a small, dangerous smile. "You saved my sister once," she said. "I guess it's my turn to save you." And so the war began. A pastor and a queen of the night, stepping together into the shadows. But they didn't know that shadows don't just hide enemies. They hide feelings. And feelings can be more dangerous than bullets. Passion in the storm. The days after David's escape were a battle of body and mind. His prison wounds, both seen and unseen, clung to him like shadows. His ribs ached from the beatings, and his legs threatened to buckle from exhaustion. But David fought through the pain. Each morning he trained, push-ups on the cold floor, stretches that burned his muscles. Lady D would watch from the doorway, arms crossed, amused at his determination. But the body was only part of the war. The mind was the real battlefield. In the evenings, David and Lady D spread out stolen documents on the floor. Ledgers, police reports, and maps. David's sharp detective mind returned, piecing together the underworld's web. He taught her how to read patterns in phone records, how to spot coded messages in financial statements. And Lady D taught him the rules of the streets, who controlled which neighborhoods, which cops were dirty, and which informants could be bought. She introduced him to the language of shadows, the handshakes, the signals, the silences. Their bond grew in the spaces between danger. At night they would talk, not about the mission, but about their scars. David spoke of his days as a cop, of how he once believed that justice was clean and simple until corruption shattered that belief. Lady D reminded him of how he saved her sister to traffickers. What a hero he is to her family. She had built her empire not for power, but for protection. Protection she had once begged for and never received. The tension between them grew, a different kind of heat, built from trust, pain, and something unspoken. Then came the storm. The night was violent. Rain pounded the windows and thunder shook the walls. They had spent hours working, their nerves frayed. A sudden crack of lightning cut through the sky, and the power flickered. Lady D lit a candle. The soft glow painted her face in golden shadow. Her eyes met David's, and the air grew thick. Not with fear, but with something deeper. "You're not the man I expected," she said softly. "And you're not the woman they say you are," he replied. The tension snapped, not in violence, but in a rush of feeling. Her lips met his, a slow, uncertain touch that carried every unsaid word. His hands, rough from years of cuffs and battles, found the curve of her back, while hers traced the scars life had carved into him. The storm outside raged, but here, inside, they found a different kind of storm, one of longing, of pain, of two souls who had only known battles but had now found a moment of surrender. It wasn't wild or rushed. It was something rare, a collision of wounds and warmth. When the storm passed, they lay side by side, the candle flickering low. Lady D broke the silence with a whisper. "You know this doesn't change anything. The underworld will still try to kill us." The night ended, but something between them had begun. Something neither of them could stop, and neither of them wanted to. The church was alive with prayer. Voices rose together, a chorus of hope and faith. The congregation filled every pew, their eyes closed, their hands lifted high. "Lord, protect our shepherd. Bring justice to your servant." The elder's voice boomed through the microphone.
"Let the truth come to light."
Tears streamed down faces. Mothers cried out. Fathers gripped their Bibles, and children knelt on the cold floor. It was a prayer meeting turned battlefield, a spiritual fight for their pastor's name. But unseen among them walked wolves in sheep's clothing. Dorothy entered quietly, wearing a modest dress and a soft headscarf. She carried a warm Bible, her lips moving as if in prayer. Behind her, 3 of her girls blended into the crowd. Their faces innocent, their eyes sharp. They knew the building, every hallway, every corner. Pastor David had shown Dorothy photos of the church's layout. Together, they had watched hours of past services, learning the faces of ushers, elders and choir members. Dorothy could now name them all. Elder Chigupu, the man who led prayers but whose heart, David warned, was stained with greed. Sister Mavis, the head usher, always by the offering basket. Deacon Phiri, whose eyes never missed anything unusual. The plan was set. Dorothy whispered through her earpiece. Positions. Thandi, dressed as a visitor, moved to the usher line, ready to distract Sister Mavis with endless questions. Rudo, in a choir robe, slipped past the pulpit, her eyes scanning the cameras. She carried a small jammer in her hymnal, ready to disrupt the security feed. Zola, posing as a member of the intercession team, dropped to her knees near the back exit, her eyes locked on the deacon watching the doors, as the congregation cried, "Fire!
Fire! Fire!"
The real fire was about to begin. Dorothy's heart pounded, but her face remained calm. In her sleeve, she carried the church vault key, a small, silver shape David told her to find under the old oak tree by the Sunday school. The vault itself was deep within the pastor's office, and only David knew the code. He had whispered it to her the night before, his voice low but sure. 7745, the year of my calling, and the day my faith was tested. The choir burst into a powerful chorus. As the organ swelled, Rudo flicked her jammer on. The security cameras froze, their feeds filled with static. Dorothy moved. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor as she slipped through the side corridor. She passed the framed photos of missions, the plaque with the church's founding date, symbols of faith, now caught in a game of survival. Inside the pastor's office, the air smelled of wood polish and old books. She found the heavy steel vault, a beast bolted to the ground. Her fingers shook as she keyed in the numbers. 7, 7, fos, a metallic click. The door swung open, revealing thick stacks of bundled notes, $80,000, meant for the church's new building in Kedona. Her throat tightened. This was holy money, pure, clean. But David had told her, money is power, and in the underworld, power is survival. Her earpiece crackled. Deacon Fiery's moving toward your corridor, Zola warned. Dorothy's hands flew, stacking bricks of cash into her bag. She slid the last bundle in, just as she heard the doorknob turn. She spun behind the office curtain, her body pressed flat against the wall. The door creaked open, and Fiery's heavy steps thudded across the floor. A long silence. Then click! The door shut again. Dorothy slipped out, her pulse racing. In the main hall, the final prayers were rising.
Let justice fall on the wicked!
Dorothy and the girls slipped out through the back, their faces calm, their hearts pounding. As they vanished into the night, the cries from the pulpit echoed behind them. God will expose every thief, inside and outside. But for now, the thieves had already won. The dimly lit room smelled of old paper and strong coffee. Scattered across the wooden table were stolen documents, police reports, bank statements, and grainy surveillance photos. A single candle flickered, casting shadows on the walls. David sat on a worn-out chair, his sharp eyes scanning a list of names he was wearing, a blue, slim-fit suit, and his mind was now sharper than ever. Across from him, Dorothy leaned back, her arms crossed, watching him with interest. So, she said, you're sure it's him? David tapped a grainy photo of Titus shaking hands with a group of masked men. I don't need to be sure, I know it. Titus set me up, and these men, they were the ones who robbed the school. Dorothy smirked. Then we have work to do. She slid a small notebook toward him. I've got names of his foot soldiers, dirty cops, street thugs, even a judge who owes him favors. But it's not enough. We need proof. David exhaled. We need to hit him where it hurts. His money, his reputation, his power. Dorothy nodded. Then let's start with the money. She grabbed her phone and made a call. Thandi, bring me that police officer we talked about. David raised an eyebrow. Bribing officers now? Dorothy chuckled. Bribery, threats. It's all the same when you need information. This guy works for Titus. He knows a hell lot. So I will show him where the pictures of his wife and where she works. I also have pictures of his son in school. We will offer him money for information. And if he says a word, he knows the sword is over his family. And the money too is more than what Titus gives him, said Dorothy with confidence in her voice. A few minutes later, a nervous young officer arrived. He hesitated at the door, eyes darting around the room. Dorothy smiled, but her voice was ice. Sit down, talk. The man swallowed hard. What do you want to know? David leaned in. Everything about Titus. And I mean everything. The young officer, Sergeant Gif Sember, sat stiffly in the wooden chair, sweat forming on his forehead. Dorothy leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while David sat across from him, his gaze steady and unreadable. The dim light made the room feel smaller, the air heavier with tension. I don't know much, Gift uttered, rubbing his palms together. Dorothy chuckled coldly. You're a bad liar. You work for Titus. You know everything. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. Now tell us what we want to know. Or I promise, the streets will know that you've been talking, whether you actually have or not, she said as she placed photos and wards of his family and wards of $50 notes. Like a prosecutor in court, Lady D spoke again. You know what this means. If you dare lie or mislead us, you are pulling the trigger for your family yourself. Gift swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he looked from Dorothy to David. All right. Titus runs things from inside the police force. He's got men in high places covering for him. But his real money comes from smuggling, drugs, weapons, and even stolen government funds. David's jaw tightened. Where's the proof? Gift hesitated. There's a warehouse down by the old railway yard. That's where he moves the big shipments. It's guarded like a fortress, though. No one gets in without his approval. Dorothy and David exchanged a glance. David leaned in. We need records, bank transfers, transactions, anything that connects Titus to this operation. Be our inner man and provide us with information. Be resourceful. If it is money you need, we will give you. Gift hesitated again, but Dorothy's sharp gaze made him flinch. There's a safe house, a small office behind a car wash in West End. He meets his key men there. If you can get inside, you'll find the records you need. David stood. Good, now disappear. Gift didn't wait to be told twice. He bolted out of the room, leaving David and Dorothy alone. Dorothy smirked. Looks like we have a date with a car wash. David nodded. Let's go hunting. The night was just beginning. David and Dorothy had been working tirelessly, gathering evidence on Titus and his criminal network. They were getting close, too close. But today, David had to focus on getting more intel. So he left the safe house to do some digging. He had a plan to take down Titus, but the pressure was mounting. When he returned to the safe house that evening, his heart sank. On the CCTV feed, he saw something that made his stomach twist. Dorothy had been taken. He watched the footage again. A black van had pulled up outside the house. 2 men jumped out, dragged Dorothy into the vehicle, and sped off. David's mind raced. He knew this was no coincidence. They had been getting too close to Titus, and now he had made his move. He was angry, but more than that, he was focused. Dorothy had become an ally, someone he trusted, and he wouldn't let Titus take her without a fight. For the next few days, David worked non-stop. He hit every corner of the city, using every resource he had to find out where Dorothy was being held. He visited old contacts, called in favors, and used his experience to dig deeper into the network. Every time he thought he was close, it turned out to be another dead end. But then, a breakthrough came. One of David's old informants gave him a lead on a warehouse down by the docks. It was one of Titus's known locations, and it made sense. The warehouse was hidden away, and if they were keeping Dorothy there, it would explain the silence. David didn't hesitate. He gathered his gear, checked his weapons, and set off to rescue Dorothy. At the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense. The dimly lit building creaked with the sound of rain tapping on the roof. Dorothy was tied to a chair, her eyes locked on the men standing in front of her. "You think you're clever, huh?" One of them sneered, pacing back and forth. "You've been digging too deep. Titus won't be happy when he finds out." Dorothy kept her head high, but inside, she knew they were in deep trouble. Her only hope was David. Meanwhile, David was outside, his trained instincts kicking in. He knew exactly what to do. He crouched low, moving like a shadow around the warehouse. He found an entry point, a small broken window at the back. He carefully slipped inside, making as little noise as possible. His mind was sharp, his movements swift. He spotted the men guarding Dorothy and took a deep breath. Now was his moment. He grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it with full force at the first man, knocking him out cold. The second man didn't even have time to react before. David slammed him into a stack of crates, leaving him unconscious. With the guards out of the way, David rushed to Dorothy's side. "Are you okay?" he whispered, cutting the ropes that bound her wrists. Dorothy let out a sigh of relief. "I knew you'd come for me," she said, her voice steady but grateful. David gave her a quick nod. "We don't have much time. Let's get out of here." David gave her a quick kiss, and they hugged in such a desperate way. "We don't have much time. Let's get out of here." They made their way out of the warehouse, careful to avoid any more of Titus's men. The adrenaline was pumping through David's veins, but he stayed focused. They had a mission to finish, and getting Dorothy to safety was just the beginning. As they drove away, David's eyes narrowed. He knew Titus was getting desperate, and if he was desperate, that meant he was getting closer to making a mistake. David and Dorothy had uncovered the first pieces of Titus's criminal empire, but it wasn't over. The real fight was just about to begin. As they drove to another safe house, Dorothy lay on David's chest. She was sobbing quietly. From time to time, David would rub her head. In that quiet drive, they sealed their friendship, alliance, and relationship with understanding beyond forgery or imitation. This was real, as David knew this was the moment he had been working for. After days of gathering the evidence and preparing his plan, he was ready to face Titus. He had everything he needed to take the corrupt. "Police Superintendent down." He sent a message to Titus using a secure channel. In it, he made it clear that he knew the truth, that Titus was behind the frame, a job that had ruined his life. But David didn't just want revenge. He offered Titus a deal. Pay him $5 million, leave the country, and the whole thing would be over. Titus, his arrogance still intact, accepted the deal, thinking it was the only way to rid himself of David once and for all. David knew Titus would try something. He'd been trying to kill David for weeks, but David was always one step ahead. The meeting was set. David would meet Titus alone, and he had arranged everything in advance. But little did Titus know that David had already notified the police, and they were ready to move at any moment. When David and Titus faced each other, the tension was thick in the air. David's calm voice broke the silence. "You know what you did, Titus. You framed me, and now you're going to pay," Titus sneered, his hand inching closer to his gun. "You think you can win, David? You're just a fugitive hiding in the shadows." David stood tall, unwavering. "Not anymore. The truth is out." Before Titus could make his next move, both men lunged at each other. Fists flew, and the sound of bones connecting with flesh echoed through the room. It was a brutal fight, each man using whatever he could to overpower the other. David's years of training gave him an edge, but Titus was no slouch either. The two men grappled, each trying to land a decisive blow. Sweat dripped down their faces, and their bodies grew tired. But neither was willing to back down. The door burst open, and the police stormed in, catching them mid-fight. David's plan had worked. The officers had come in at the perfect time to take Titus down.
Arrest this fugitive officers!
"Thank you for coming. He had held me hostage," said Titus, showing relief. "No, sir, we are here to arrest you," said the S&R officer who was leading the operation. The police quickly moved in, arresting Titus and securing the room. "You're finished, Titus," David said, his voice firm. "You've lost." Titus tried to resist arrest, but he was overpowered. Journalists and bloggers pointed their mics at Titus. "What do you have to say for yourself, Sup?" asked one journalist working for the state broadcast. "I'm innocent. Can you not see this is the work of the corrupt system?"
I am fighting!
thundered Titus as he was spitting blood his lips, cracked from the blows he had received on his face like confetti. "What now, Pastor? How do you feel after all your battles? From being a fugitive to now being a hero?" asked another journalist with microphones and cell phones. While camera-flushing lights were hitting, Pastor David, let justice prevail. Weeks later, all the charges against Pastor David were dropped. David stood at the ceremony for the launch of his foundation, The Second Chance, a foundation that helps former convicts, a celebration of justice, redemption, and the new path he had forged. He was surrounded by his family, his wife and children, reunited and happy to be together once again. But there, standing beside him, was Dorothy. She had been his ally, his partner in taking down Titus. Her courage had been the key to his success, and now she stood with him, watching as the crowd cheered for the man who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. David held up a small, leather-bound Bible and handed it to Dorothy. On the inside, he had inscribed a simple quote, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." Dorothy took the Bible, her eyes welling up. She had risked everything for him, and in return, David had given her something, more than she could ever ask for, hope and a chance at redemption. As David stood there, looking out at the crowd, he knew his fight was far from over. But this time, it was a fight for something greater. He wasn't just fighting for his name anymore. He was fighting for the future of the city, for the broken souls who had nowhere to turn, and for the healing of a community that had been broken by evil systems. His mind on something else. The dance he had with Dorothy had ended. As people hailed him and gave large sums of donations, his mind was raging. There was a storm in his heart. Polygamy. The word just dropped in his mind like an atomic bomb, shattering everything he believed as a pastor. Would he marry a second wife? A wife who runs a brothel? What would people say? He thought and thought. He was brought back to the world when the announcer invited him to make a speech. As the ceremony was successfully done, Pastor David walked Dorothy to her car, his wife in tail. In her hands, Dorothy had a leather Bible unscripted. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. See you in part 2 of The Pastor Who Danced with a Prostitute.